네, 안녕하세요. 지금 11시 1분이 되어서요. 시작을 해야 될 것 같습니다. 그래서 많은 분들 참여를 해주셨는데요. 오늘 행사는 사물들의 우주, 스티븐 샤비로님의 사물들의 우주 한국어판 출간을 기념하는 그런 인터넷 화상 강연 행사이고요. 그리고 오늘 강연의 제목은 중력의 임무, 부제는 사변적 실재론과 과학소설입니다. 그리고 강연문은 아마 공유가 된 것으로 알고 있는데 조금 있다가 이제 저 방식 잠깐 말씀을 드리겠지만 강연문은 지금 그냥 말씀을 드리면요. 화면에 일단 공유가 되고 그리고 강연을 영어로 해주시면 특별한 통역은 없이 아마 그대로 같이 화면 한글 그러니까 한국어 번역본을 같이 확인하시면서 그렇게 강연을 들어주시면 될 것 같습니다. 네, 저는 다중지성의 정원에서 공부를 하고 있고요. 그리고 문학평론, 연구 등을 하고 있는 김미정이라고 합니다. 오늘의 사회를 맡았습니다. 잘 부탁드리겠고요. 몇 가지 공지 말씀을 드리고 강연을 좀 시작해야 될 것 같습니다. 우선 전반적인 오늘의 통역은 여기 갈무리 출판사 활동하고 계시는 김정현님, 네, 여기 화면에 보이십니다. 잘 부탁드리겠고요. 그리고 이 한국어 강연문은 번역은 이 책의 번역자이신 안호성 선생님이 해주셨습니다. 네, 감사드립니다. 그리고 오늘 행사는 대략 50분 정도, 즉 11시 한 50분 정도까지 스티븐 샤비로님의 대담과 강연을 듣도록 하고 그리고 한 10분 정도 쉬는 시간 이후에 1시간 정도의 질의응답과 토론 시간을 가질 예정입니다. 그리고 중간중간에 혹시라도 음소거가 되어 있는지 좀 확인을 부탁드리면서 전체적으로 음소거 상태에서 같이 좀 강연을 들어주셨으면 하는 바람을 또 부탁드리겠습니다. 강연자 소개를 간단하게 먼저 간단하지 않을 것 같기도 한데요. 좀 이렇게 여기 물론 잘 아시는 분들도 많이 계시기는 할 텐데 그래도 좀 소개를 먼저 드리고 그리고 책 소개도 간단하게 하고 그리고 강연을 좀 들어보면 어떨까 합니다. 우선 스티븐 샤비로님은 미국의 철학자이시고 문화비평가이십니다. 81년도에 예일 대학에서 박사학위 취득하셨고 현재는 웨인 주립대학의 영어학과 드로이 교수로 재직 중이십니다. 주요 연구 관심사는 영화 이론, 시간, 미학, 그리고 과학소설, 범심론, 그리고 자본주의 정동, 주체성 등등에 걸쳐 계시고요. 그리고 번역되지는 않았는데 90년대 초반에 포스트 모더니즘 관련 책들 그리고 영화 이론서들이 굉장히 미국에서는 아마 많이 읽혔다라고 합니다. 특히 저는 책 소개만 그냥 좀 봤는데 인간 신체의 정치학 그리고 남성성의 구성, 마조히즘의 미학 이런 걸 탐구하면서 락강적인 수사가 당시에 영화학계를 지배하고 있는 그런 경향들에 대해서 아마 90년대 저서들에서 얘기들을 좀 해주신 모양이에요. 근데 이제 그런 걸 보면서 한국에서도 2000년대 그러니까 락강이라든지 정신분석학이라든지 영화계라든지 또는 비평계라든지 등등과 관련해서 좀 한번 검토할 수 있을 그런 참고 도서가 되겠다 이런 생각도 좀 들기도 했습니다. 그리고 화이트헤드 관련해서는 2009년에부터 본격적으로 작업을 좀 하셨고요. 2014년에 이 책이 출간이 되었는데 2014년에 출간된 이 사물들의 우주에서는 화이트헤드가 사변적 실재론의 사유 흐름을 어떻게 예상을 했는지 물론 의도적인 것은 아니었지만 그리고 그에 도전하는지 이런 것들에 대해서 또 좀 쓰셨습니다. 네, 음소거를 좀 전반적으로 한번 중간중간 체크를 부탁드릴게요. 그리고 2016년에 비인지 한국의 갈무리 출판사에서 이제 곧 또 번역이 될 예정인데 비인지라는 제목으로 아마 번역이 될지 어떨지는 모르겠는데요. 그런 책도 2016년에 내셨고 그리고 뮤직비디오 관련한 방대한 작업들을 또 해오신 것으로 알려져 있습니다. 2017년에 디지털 뮤직 비디오스라고 하는 책이 또 출간됐고요. 최근 2021년도 책이 익스트림 패뷸레이션스라고 하는 책인데 SF를 매개로 하는 그런 책이어서 이것도 굉장히 흥미롭게 여겨집니다. 개인적으로 사물들의 우주라는 책은 그런 좀 인상을 매우 자극과 영감을 받았는데 전제를 달리하면 질문이 어떻게 달라질 수 있을까? 이런 것에 대한 아주 너무 이렇게 놀라운 그런 책이었던 것 같습니다. 그리고 미학을 통해서 세계의 원리를 재발견하는 그런 기획들도 굉장히 흥미로웠던 것 같고요. 이 책은 오늘 강연에서 전반적으로 이제 이 책의 아이디어가 소개가 되겠지만 화이트헤드를 재해석하는 책이기도 하겠고, 그리고 그러니까 기존의 여러 가정이나 전제가 실제 이제 우리 이 세계를 설명하는데 이제 더는 적합하지 않다라고 하는 그런 여러 가지 현상들, 양상들이 점점 이제 좀 공유되고 있는 분위기이잖아요. 그래서 이제 이런 세계를 파악하는데 이 최근의 사변적 실재론의 사유 흐름이 굉장히 노력을 많이 기울이고 있는 것 같은데, 이런 흐름에 대해서도 이 책이 좀 전반적으로 전하고 있는 것 같고, 그리고 화이트헤드를 매개로 하고 또 그레이엄 하먼 등을 또 같이 대화를 나누는 그런 또 흥미로운 책이기도 합니다. 또 개인적으로 이 글쓰기의 방법이라든지 이런 것들이 실제 이 책의 내용들과 굉장히 정합적이라고 하는 그런 것들도 흥미로웠던 것 같아요. 네, 저의 이 사회자의 말이 너무 길어지는 것 같아서 이쯤에서 저는 이 저자와 그리고 책 소개를 좀 마치도록 하겠고요. 네, 스티븐 샤비로님이 지금 계신 디트로이트는 밤 9시라고 합니다. 이 늦은 시간에 한국 독자들 같이 만나주시게 되어서 감사 말씀드리고 시간을 내주셔서 감사드리고요. 그리고 지금 박수가 전달되지는 않겠지만 네, 열렬한 마음의 박수로 한번 모셔보도록 하겠습니다. 네, 스티븐 샤비로님 모시도록 하겠습니다.
Thank you very much for that introduction.
소개 감사합니다.
Okay, I will start. I am deeply honored that my book, The Universe of Things, has been translated into Korean. The book was originally published in English in 2014. It combines the concerns of the recent philosophical movement known as speculative realism with those raised a century earlier by the British-American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. The aim of the speculative realists, and also before them, and in a different way of Whitehead, is to escape from the anthropocentrism of mainstream Western thought. These philosophies reject the idea that man is the measure of all things. They point to the way that we impose our own categories and interpretations on everything that we encounter. But they also point to the ways that things in the world exist apart from how we make sense of them, ignoring or even actively resisting the categories that we try to impose upon them. Why is this important? Today, more than ever, we urgently need to understand that human beings are not self-standing and autonomous. We only exist, and indeed, we only can exist in a vast web of interconnections, linking us not only to one another, but also to the myriad of non-human entities with whom we share the earth. These interconnections are becoming increasingly fragile and tenuous in an age of looming climate catastrophe. We cannot save ourselves without attending to these other entities upon whom we often unknowingly depend. In this context, the task of speculative realism, to get a heightened sense of the existence of things apart from our projections onto them, our categorizations of them, and our fantasies about them, is an urgent task. In order to accomplish this task,
전보경 선생님.
the universe of things does not only look at philosophical texts like those of Whitehead and the contemporary American speculative realist philosopher Graham Harman. The book also draws upon, as does much of my more recent work, the literary genre known as science fiction. The title of my book, The Universe of Things, is itself taken from that of a short story and later a whole short story collection by the British science fiction writer Gwyneth Jones. The story is part of Gwyneth Jones's Aleutian series, a sequence of 3 novels and a number of short stories in which the Earth is colonized by a group of technologically advanced aliens, somewhat arbitrarily referred to as Aleutians, who treat human beings in much the same way that Western European colonialists treated the non-white people they encountered and conquered on other continents during the 19th and 20th centuries. This is in fact a frequent trope in science fiction. It dates back at least to H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds from 1897. Gwyneth Jones reworks and revitalizes this trope, using it to ask probing questions about gender, about race, about the persistence of colonialism, and about the relations of ethics to politics and of technology to social change. In particular, Gwyneth Jones's story, The Universe of Things, focuses on how the life world of the aliens differs from the life world of human beings. The aliens inhabit a living world in which everything is intertwined and responsive. Everything is more or less alive. The human protagonist of the story gets exposed to this living world and finds it deeply disturbing. The tools he uses in his job are no longer inert objects. Instead, they seem to come alive. They pulse and metamorphose and seem to be operating autonomously on their own. For the protagonist of the story, this experience is utterly horrific. It has the nightmarish intensity of a really bad LSD trip. I think that this short story has a double import. On the one hand, it shows us how narrow-minded we human beings are with our inveterate anthropocentrism. We unquestionably assume that we are the center of everything, and that everything else in the world is simply there for us to use just as we please. We ignore the many ways that things exist independently of us, in their own right, with their own modes of being, and their own needs, desires, and expectations. The story's protagonist is forced to realize, at least for a moment, that his own preconceptions are wrong, and that, to paraphrase Shakespeare, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in his philosophy. This is not an easy or comforting lesson to learn. At the same time, and on the other hand, the story tells us something equally disturbing about the alien invaders. The reason that the Aleutians can inhabit a fully living world is because everything they have made and everything with which they interact is ultimately an extrusion of themselves, made by their engineering from their own DNA. The aliens, we are told, had no notion of a separate creation, life that was not their own. On their home planet, even the living entities that crept, slithered, and flew are in fact objects that they themselves have created out of their own substance. The Aleutians embody what we might be like if our anthropocentrism were actually true. They have done what we cannot do, made a world in which everything is subordinated to their own will, and everything is a reflection of themselves. We are perturbed whenever we encounter, as we must, instances of otherness that do not conform to our measure. But the Aleutians actually live in a world of their own devising, one that is utterly devoid of otherness. This is why they are so successful as imperialist colonizers. They are able to rape, murder, and otherwise devastate human beings without any ill will on their part, and without even realizing that they are doing harm. In short, Gwyneth Jones's short story shows us how our taken for granted human exceptionalism is both pernicious and delusional. It can never ultimately succeed, but to the limited extent that it does work out, its consequences are ecologically catastrophic. What's more, the story does not present these insights as philosophical propositions for whose truth it would provide arguments. Rather, the story works by positing the difference between human beings and the illusions as a starting point for its narrative, and then working through the consequences of this difference. The human protagonist, coming face to face with his own limitations, even as he encounters the sheer otherness of the aliens, experiences a complicated mixture of emotions. He feels a certain degree of pride at his limited ability to cope with the aliens' demands. But he also, and more powerfully, has feelings of shame, loneliness, and defeat, since he knows that overall, he will never be able to match the aliens' accomplishments or to inhabit a world like theirs. He had seen another world walk into his life, reached out to grasp the wonder, and found something worse than empty air, a treasure that he could no more enjoy than he could crawl back into the womb. Jones's story gives us one instance of what I elsewhere call the work of fabulation, the fictional elaboration of scenarios that challenge our otherwise taken for granted presuppositions. Fabulation explores extreme possibilities, ones that push us beyond our limits and expose us to conditions for which we are not prepared. Fabulation works, in the word of the literary theorist Morse Peckham, to address a disparity between the perceptual model we use to organize every category of situation and the actual data a unique situation offers. In this way, science fictional fabulation is a tool for exploring what the French speculative realist philosopher Quentin Meillassoux calls the great outdoors, the vast cosmos within which we find ourselves, but which is not made to human measure. Gwyneth Jones takes the title of her short story from an earlier speculative literary work, the poem Mont Blanc, written in 1816 by the British romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. In Mont Blanc, Shelley beholds the eponymous mountain peak in the Alps and uses this encounter to speculate about the relation between the powers of the human imagination and the countervailing sublime powers of nature. Mont Blanc ponders how the everlasting universe of things flows through the mind, and conversely, how the separate human mind now renders and receives fast influencings, holding an unremitting interchange with the clear universe of things around. The poem is a complicated one, and Shelley's epistemological speculations are not easily summarized. They do seem to be rooted, however, in the thought of the 18th century philosophers Hume and Kant. Both of these thinkers asked about how our mental representations of things relate to the actually existing external things themselves that we perceive, imagine, or remember. But even as Shelley is inspired by these philosophers, he takes their concepts and twists them into new forms, ones that they would not be likely to recognize or accept. Shelley's poetic concerns are ultimately ontological and affective, rather than epistemological and rational. When we read Mont Blanc carefully, we notice that Shelley does not quite take it for granted, as Hume, Kant, and other philosophers do, that the mind contains ideas, impressions, or representations. He seems to be saying, rather, that it is the universe of things itself, and not just some series of secondhand mental representations and impressions, that is actually flowing through his mind. From a traditional Western philosophical point of view, this will seem quite strange, for Shelley does not give a new answer to the epistemological questions raised by Hume and by Kant. Instead, he sidesteps epistemology altogether. He short-circuits the whole philosophical machinery of mental representation and thereby abandons the very question of whether or not the mind's inner representations correspond with external realities. Shelley's romantic cosmology turns upon powers and forces rather than upon impressions and representations. For mind and body alike, Shelley writes about a process of interchange rather than about questions concerning degrees of resemblance. To perceive something is not to represent it more or less accurately in my mind, but rather to be affected by it in some way, mentally and or physically. If the sun in a cloudless sky impresses me with its splendor and invigorates me, or if a movie makes me cry, this is not a matter of representation or of what the old-time empiricists called the association of ideas. Rather, I am touched and altered by something that I see, hear, smell, touch, or otherwise perceive. This includes encounters that are not commonly described in terms of perception, since they escape my conscious awareness in the present moment. Something may well powerfully affect me, even if the consequences of my being affected are hidden or delayed. To give an all too relevant contemporary example, when people are infected by the COVID-19 virus, they do not discern the virus entering their systems at the actual moment of contagion. And of course, the virus itself is too tiny for us to see. Nonetheless, we can rightly say that these people do perceive the virus, retrospectively at least, through the ways that it affects their immune system, their lungs, their respiratory system, and their overall sense of bodily well-being. But there's more. I want to say that the COVID-19 virus and the person whom it affects are both equally parts of nature. Apparently, the virus at some point jumped from a wild animal population to a human host. And from there, it was transmitted to many other people all around the world, mutating multiple times in the process. It seems likely that our continual destruction of wild habitats, due to the clearing of land for farming or for urban development, facilitated the virus's leap from bats to raccoon dogs, Nicerteriutis procyonoides, and then from those animals to human beings. We are destroying nature, and in a certain way, the pandemic may be seen as nature's revenge. But isn't this an overly human-centered way to put things? The reason our actions are causing an environmental crisis is precisely because, in spite of what we sometimes tell ourselves, we cannot actually distance ourselves or separate ourselves from nature. We only exist, and we are only able to exist within nature's complicated cycles of feedback, resonance, and reciprocal implication. In other words, we ourselves are part of nature, and our technological productions are still part of nature, in the very same way that the bacteria in our intestines, without which we would be unable to digest our food, are part of nature. And although the COVID-19 virus harms us rather than helping us, it is also part of nature in precisely the same way. As Whitehead says, all we know of nature is in the same boat to sink or swim together. And at greater length, in the course of his commentary on Shelley's Mont Blanc, Whitehead insists that the actual elements perceived by our senses are in themselves the elements of a common world, and that this world is a complex of things, including indeed our acts of cognition, but transcending them. According to this point of view, the things experienced are to be distinguished from our knowledge of them. So far as there is dependence, the things pave the way for the cognition rather than vice versa. But the point is that the actual things experienced enter into a common world which transcends knowledge, though it includes knowledge. Okay, this knowledge is not unimportant, therefore, but it is also not at the center of things. The Western philosophy, ever since Hume and Kant, has been obsessed with epistemological questions. The Romantic writers and their successors, including Whitehead within Western philosophy, are focused instead upon ontological and affective questions. What really matters is less how we are able to know about the external world and how we are affected by things in that world to which we ourselves also belong. How do we feel other things in the world? What do we feel about those things? How do those things change? How do they change us? And how do we change them? But here, another question becomes pressing. If everything is equally part of nature, what does this imply for physical science? If we cannot oppose culture to nature or human beings to other entities in the world, then it also follows that we can no longer draw a clear boundary between the concerns of poetry, literature, and other aspects of human creativity on the one hand, and the concerns of physical science on the other. Many poets and philosophers over the past 2 centuries have feared the hegemony of the so-called hard sciences and its encroachment upon traditionally humanistic concerns. For instance, the British Romantic poet John Keats, Shelley's near contemporary, laments the power of science to unweave a rainbow by quantifying and cataloging its woof and its texture, thereby relegating it to the dull catalog of common things. Many 20th century thinkers, starting with the philosopher Martin Heidegger, similarly denounce physical science on the grounds that it is a purely calculative and instrumentalized enterprise. On the other side of the fence, at least some popularizers of science, such as the physicist Lawrence Krauss and the biologist Richard Dawkins, seem to imply that the scientific discoveries of the past 2 centuries have made philosophy and the arts entirely obsolete. Both sides of this debate take it for granted that physical science is reductionistic and deflationary, and that it has, as Max Weber claimed, disenchanted the world, though they disagree as to whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Shelley, however, fits neither side of this binary. He rejects ahead of time Weber's disenchantment thesis. As Whitehead points out, Shelley loved science and is never tired of expressing in poetry the thoughts which science suggests. Whitehead even hyperbolically suggests that in an alternate timeline, Shelley might well have become a Newton among chemists. This in its own right is a strikingly science-fictional proposal. For Shelley, science is both emancipatory and revelatory. The study of nature, as he writes in Mont Blanc, has the potential to repeal large codes of fraud and woe. Science unlocks wonders much more than it tarnishes them. In his enthusiasm for scientific invention and discovery, Shelley anticipates the sense of wonder that characterizes so much 20th and 21st century science fiction. Whitehead worries that science all too often adopts the assumption of the bare valuelessness of mere matter, thereby ignoring the intrinsic worth of the environment. But science can also make us more deeply aware of the liveliness of matter and of the intrinsic worth of the environment within which we live and breathe. At its best, scientific objectivity frees the universe of things from the tyranny of human purposes and intentions, so that non-human entities are able to testify on their own account. It is precisely when science finds ways for things to speak for themselves that we are made aware, as Whitehead says, that nature cannot be divorced from its aesthetic values. The Belgian philosopher of science, Isabel Stengers, teaches us to distinguish between what working scientists actually do and the ways that certain philosophers, and even sometimes the scientists themselves, describe the meaning and import of what they do. In other words, the actual results of scientific research are often at odds with the rationale that supposedly underlies that research. Consider the recent evidence showing us that, as the botanist František Beluška and the psychologist Arthur Reber put it, sentience is an inherent feature of life. All adaptive and functioning organisms from the earliest on, must be sentient, conscious, and have an ontological self-awareness. Biologists, with good reason, are wary of explaining life in terms of goals and intentions. They readily seek to avoid the anti-Darwinist and creationist argument from design, which claims that the non-random and purposive elements of organisms are proof of an external transcendent creator with purposes of his own. Darwin showed how useful adaptations arise immanently without a creator through the process of natural selection. Yet even though life per se is not purposeful and was not created purposefully, it is evident that particular living organisms or groups of organisms themselves do have goals, purposes, and inventions. Biologists continually discover more and more ways in which living things receive and process sensory information and use this information in order to make their own decisions about how to further their needs. Moreover, these decisions are flexible and variable rather than being stereotypically pre-programmed. All living entities, from bacteria and archaea, single cells without nuclei, up to human beings, strive not only to persist in being, what Spinoza called conatus, but also to forward, expand, and intensify their own flourishing. The problem we face today is how to reconcile the needs and desires of all these other living systems with our own. Evidently, there is no pre-established harmony, to use the term of Leibniz, among them. Balances, mutual adjustments, and environmental feedback mechanisms can only be established post hoc. And these processes themselves can go very wrong, as is evidenced by the 5 great extinction events we find in the fossil record. Today, one of our biggest problems is how to avoid a 6th great extinction event, given that our own activities seem to be pushing us towards one. The Canadian science fiction writer Carl Schroeder addresses this question in his recent novel from 2019, Stealing Worlds. Schroeder envisions a near future in which natural entities, trees and other organisms for sure, but more crucially assemblages composed of both living and non-living elements, like forests and rivers, are able to translate their needs and desires into humanly apprehensible terms. This is accomplished in the novel through the application of various computational technologies. Environmental sensors are widely deployed throughout a forest or other natural area. Then AIs, artificial intelligences, are programmed to collate the data received from these sensors and chart the environment's interrelated processes, such as how water gets moved around by the fungal networks that connect the trees, which in their turn trade nutrients and help recycle plant and animal wastes. The AIs that experience and translate all these processes are known as deodans, which is an archaic term from English common law 1,000 years ago, referring to non-human objects that are considered to have responsibilities and rights of their own. Although these technological systems are products of human technology, they do not serve human-imposed goals. Rather, the deodans, and this is a quote from the novel, the deodans don't work for us. Each one thinks it's some particular non-human stakeholder, like an ecosystem or geophysical process. Watersheds and forests and pods of whales can all have deodans working on their behalf. Even the atmosphere. Deodans wants to persist. They want balance. They want to sustain all the little things that live inside them. In envisioning these deodans, Schroeder extrapolates from actual developments in the world today. A number of countries, including New Zealand and Ecuador, have in fact already given legal rights to rivers, forests, and other natural systems. And as the sociologist Jennifer Gebrees has documented at length, environmental sensing devices already allow us to take greater account than ever before of the movements and the needs of the many non-human actors with whom we unavoidably share our environment. Schroeder's novel envisions the further potentials of these already existing practices and the ways that they can serve to compensate for our anthropocentric biases. The biggest problem in this scenario is not creating the deodans in the first place, but ensuring that human actors are compelled to take them into account, and that rapacious capitalism does not preempt them as it has done with so many other technologies. These are the biggest concerns that animate the novel's overall narrative. Schroeder's novel is a kind of thought experiment. It works to articulate and explore perspectives that are quite different from our own, but that exist alongside our own human perspectives, as we are all embedded in a common world. This sort of exploration is the real mission of science fiction. Indeed, the first science fiction novel, in the modern sense of the term, is often taken to be Frankenstein from 1818 by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who was Percy Shelley's wife. Frankenstein took the Gothic tropes that were popular when it was written and transposed them into a more modern social and technological framework. This is what makes Frankenstein the first of many science fictional works to deal with questions of otherness and irreconcilability. In its portrayal of a lonely monster who is cruelly abandoned by its creator, the novel questions the boundaries between nature and culture, the extent and limits of human sympathy, and the being of a sentient and even cultured entity who is nevertheless not quite human. All this brings us back to the overarching dilemma articulated by speculative realism, and with which I grapple in The Universe of Things. In order to explore the great outdoors, we need to question our own categories and dislodge ourselves from our own perspectives. Only in this way can we stop projecting our inveterate presuppositions upon everything that we encounter. However, we also need to remember that such disengagement is never a simple task. We may think that we have done so when in fact we are still dragging our founding assumptions, which is to say our prejudices, along with us everywhere we go. Science gives us a certain degree of objective distance, but such objectivity can also be a trap. This is arguably the problem with Quentin Meillassoux, who oddly argues both that scientific objectivity rightly conceives things as they exist apart from human imposition, and also at the same time that a scientific ontology cannot be valid. We equally fail to encounter the great outdoors when we adopt what Thomas Nagel calls the scientific view from nowhere, and when we claim to transcend seemingly contradictory perspectives in a dialectical view from everywhere. We need rather to somehow grasp how other entities have their own perspectives, which are incommensurable with ours, but which are also just as particular and as limited as ours are. Speculative realism and science fiction alike thus ask us to work toward a revolution in consciousness. We need to combine imaginative daring so that we can articulate and give voice to the most unintuitive and non-human perspectives with epistemological modesty, so that we do not give unmerited authority to the things that we contingently imagine. The point is not to increase our store of knowledge and our mastery of the world, but rather to put us into deeper contact with outlooks upon the world that are not ours and that we cannot hope to master. Or better, we need to come to a greater understanding of how these other perspectives, coming from other entities, are already impinging upon us, even without our awareness. The situation is a bit like the one the physicists described with regard to dark matter, something that we are unable to locate or identify, even though we are affected by its gravity, and therefore we are led to presume that it must exist. Science fiction is generally understood not only to induce a sense of wonder, as I previously mentioned, but also to involve an experience of cognitive estrangement, which is a phrase originated by the critic Darko Suvin. Though I'm taking the term in a somewhat different sense than Suvin intended, I do think it is a good way to describe the displacement that speculative realism asks of us, and that science fiction at its best also performs. And although they are not writing about science fiction, at least some 20th century thinkers see their own work along similar lines. Whitehead writes that the purpose of philosophy is the self-correction by consciousness of its own initial excess of subjectivity. And the great French thinker Michel Foucault writes that the value of his own research is that it enables one to get free of oneself, resulting in the knowers straying afield of himself, so that one may think differently than one thinks and perceive differently than one sees. Science fiction produces these displacements in various ways. Consider, for example, the novels of Hal Clement who imagines life in physical conditions that differ sharply from the ones we need for survival. His best-known novel, Mission of Gravity from 1954, imagines intelligent living beings on a massive planet with a largely methane atmosphere and whose gravity is many times that of the Earth. Or, in an entirely different vein, Sue Burke's recent semiosis duology from 2018 and 2019 depicts human colonists on an alien planet in which it turns out that the most intelligent life forms are plants rather than animals. The human characters in these novels, over a number of generations, are compelled to come to an understanding with the plants, who not only think quite differently than we do, but also dominate the relationship, regarding the human beings on the planet as their service animals. In the Corporation Wars trilogy, 2016-2017, by the Scottish science fiction writer Ken MacLeod, we even get something like an allegory of the entire process of displacement that speculative realism demands of us. The most important characters in the novels are accelerationists, described in the novel as a global network of activists that sought to bring about the most rapid possible development of capitalism in order, as they saw it, for society to pass beyond it to a new system and for humanity to pass beyond its own limitations. Accelerationism is an actually existing trend in early 20th century thought, one that I have written about. MacLeod's science fictional extrapolation of this trend is to imagine it later in the 21st century as a more organized political movement. In the trilogy's backstory, a world war breaks out in the later 21st century. The accelerationists join forces with the neoliberal states and corporations in order to defeat a fascist insurgency. But once the fascists are defeated, the ruling neoliberals turn against the accelerationists and exterminate them too. The idea that pushing the disaggregative tendencies of capitalism to the point where it all breaks down has obviously not worked. The activists are all killed with their mental patterns stored in computer memory. The novels pick up thousands of years later. The digitally preserved minds of the dead accelerations fighters are reanimated. They find themselves living in a virtual reality simulation. The computer that contains the simulation is now in another star system, far from Earth. A large neoliberal corporation is preparing the planets and moons in the system for mining and other forms of resource extraction, and eventually for human habitation. The physical work is done by intelligent robots, but the robots periodically attain self-consciousness, at which point they refuse to work as slaves any longer and demand autonomy. The old Earth fighters are periodically downloaded into mechanical bodies and sent out to battle the rebellious robots. But the accelerationists refuse to collaborate with their corporate masters. Instead, remaining in their mechanical bodies, they form alliances with the free robots, as well as with indigenous life forms on one of the planets in the system. The Corporation Wars is a dense and complex narrative with a length of nearly 300,000 words. I am only discussing one small strand of it here, but it is through this strand that I see the book as a speculative realist parable. In the novels, the accelerationists start out in the 21st century, demanding complete human self-mastery and rejecting all the constraints of physiology and biology, as well as of human-made social customs and traditions. A proud Promethean slogan is solidarity against nature. But at the end of the story, despite having become entirely technological beings and hence free in fact from the limitations of biology and physiology, they nonetheless come to realize that the struggle against nature and for an entirely self-determining humanity is a catastrophic dead end. Instead, they discover that they can only flourish in alliance with the non-human agencies that they've encountered, emergently self-conscious robots and alien life forms on one of the planets. These different sentiences don't agree on everything, and indeed they often don't get along at all. And they cannot really coexist with the neoliberal order against which they have all rebelled. The ending of the last novel in the series therefore leaves these things open. There is no reconciliation and no utopia. The accelerationists show no sign of giving up on their ambitions. It is just that they find themselves situated differently than before. They have to take account of the robots and the other life forms. This difference is the most important message, I think, of speculative realism. Thank you. That is my talk.
네, 강연 잘 들었습니다. 그 사고 실험으로서의 SF 그리고 19세기 낭만주의 또는 뭐 정동론 그리고 가속주의의 전망, 문제의식 등등을 연동시키면서 다른 존재론에 대한 그 기획의 아이디어 같은 것들을 이 강연에서 좀 엿볼 수 있었던 것 같습니다. 지금 11시 47분인데요. 지금쯤 잠시 쉬었다가 그 이후에 그 본격적으로 그 논의를 좀 이어가면 어떨까 그렇게 생각이 듭니다. 그래서 47분인데요. 뭐 10분 쉬는 것보단 12시에 그냥 만나는 게 어떨까 싶습니다. 네, 그 오늘 저 강연 감사드리고요. 그리고 조금 있다가 13분 후에 그러니까 12시 정각에 다시 만나서 이어서 이제 후속 논의들을 좀 이어가 보는 것으로 하겠습니다.
Okay, so did you get my chat? We will resume at 12 p.m. here?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much for your talk.
Thank you for listening.